Did you know that 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is the most recognized address in the world? The White House. Every year, 400,000 people tour this building. They walk through the East Room, they see the State Dining Room, they stand where presidents have stood for over 200 years. But here is what the tour guides do not tell you. Here is what history books skip over. Here is the truth that America buried for 2 centuries. The people who built the White House were not free. Hundreds of them were enslaved. They cut stone with their hands, they laid brick in the summer heat, they carved wood in the winter cold, and when the work was done they received nothing, not $1, not 1 cent. Their names were not written down, their work was not acknowledged. They were treated as property, not people. This is not a story from ancient history. This is American history. This building still stands today. Every president has lived here. The enslaved workers who built it have been forgotten for 200 years. Until now, let me show you the numbers, the real numbers, the ones they do not teach in school. The White House was built between 1792 and 1800, 8 years of construction. The original cost was $232,372. In today's money, that is over $7 million. The project required hundreds of workers. Stonemasons, carpenters, bricklayers, laborers. About half were free workers who earned wages. The other half were enslaved people who earned nothing. $0, zero recognition, zero freedom. The federal government kept detailed records. Payment ledgers still exist in the National Archives. These documents show exactly what happened. The government hired enslaved workers from their owners. The owners received $5 per month for each enslaved person. The workers themselves received nothing. This was not hidden. This was official policy. Written down, documented, normal for the time. Let me give you specific numbers so you understand the scale. At least 400 enslaved people worked on the White House at different times during construction. Some worked for a few months. Others worked for years. They quarried stone 40 miles away. They transported it by barge along the Potomac River. They shaped each block by hand. They positioned the stones, they mixed the mortar, they built the walls that still stand today. The payment records list their owners by name. Paid to Mr. Blagden for hire of Negro labor. Paid to Mr. Williams for 5 Negroes 1 month. The records are clear. The records are detailed. But the records almost never mention the workers' names, just Negro labor or 5 Negroes or hired slaves. Not people, property. Here is another number that should shock you. The government saved over $100,000 in $1,800 by using enslaved labor instead of paying free workers. That is roughly $3 million in today's money. Half the construction cost came from unpaid labor, stolen labor. Think about that, America's most famous building, the symbol of democracy, the symbol of freedom, built partly by people who had no freedom at all. Now let me tell you why this matters. Why this is not just old history that we can ignore. Because for 200 years nobody talked about it, tour guides never mentioned it, history books skipped over it, school lessons ignored it. Millions of people visited the White House. They learned about presidents, they learned about architecture, they learned about important events that happened there. Nobody told them about the enslaved workers who built it. This was not an accident, this was a choice. America chose to forget. America chose to ignore the uncomfortable truth. Because acknowledging enslaved workers would create a problem. It would force people to ask questions. How can a nation founded on freedom use enslaved labor? How can the building that symbolizes democracy be constructed by people denied all democratic rights? How can we celebrate this house without acknowledging the people who actually built it? Those questions are uncomfortable. So America just did not ask them. For 2 centuries, let me show you what the official story looked like. The story they told for 200 years. The White House was designed by James Hoban, an Irish architect. Construction began in 1792. President John Adams and his wife Abigail were the first to live there in 1800. The house was burned by British forces in 1814 during the War of 1812. It was rebuilt and painted white, which is how it got its name. That is the story. Notice what is missing. The workers, the hundreds of people who actually did the building. The free craftsmen get mentioned sometimes, the enslaved workers never. Here is what really happened on October 13, 1792. That date is important. It is when construction officially began. There was a ceremony. They laid the cornerstone. President George Washington was there. Commissioners who oversaw the project were there. Local officials came. It was a big event, and then the workers showed up. Two groups, free workers and enslaved workers, both carrying tools, both ready to work, both essential to the project. The free workers came from Europe mostly. Scotland, Ireland, England. They had trained as stonemasons or carpenters in their home countries. They immigrated to America looking for opportunity. They found work building the new capital. Good work, steady pay, about $1, $50 to $3 per week depending on skill level. The enslaved workers came from Maryland and Virginia. Both were slave states. Both had farmers who owned enslaved people. Those farmers hired out their enslaved workers to the federal government. The government paid the farmers, the workers got nothing. Both groups did the same work, both cut stone, both laid brick, both framed walls, both built stairs. The difference was not skill. The difference was legal status, free or enslaved, paid or unpaid. Let me give you a specific example. A real example from the payment records. In 1795, the government paid a man named Blagden $60 for hire of Negro labor for 1 year. That is $5 per month. Blagden owned the enslaved worker. Blagden got paid, the worker did not. The worker spent 1 full year cutting stone or mixing mortar or hauling materials. 12 months of hard physical labor. 0 compensation. Multiply that by 400 workers. Multiply that by 8 years of construction. The amount of unpaid labor is staggering. Now here is what makes this even more disturbing. George Washington knew exactly what was happening. He approved it. He probably suggested it. Why? Because Washington himself owned over 300 enslaved people at his plantation, Mount Vernon. He understood the system. He used enslaved labor for his own projects. Using enslaved labor for government projects seemed completely normal to him. Thomas Jefferson was the same. He owned over 600 enslaved people. When he became president in 1801, he continued using enslaved workers to finish the White House. He saw no contradiction. He wrote about freedom and equality while enslaving hundreds of people. The White House was just one more project. This is the reality of early America. The founders talked about liberty. They wrote beautiful words about all men being created equal, and then they used enslaved people to build their capital city. Let me tell you about the work itself. What these enslaved workers actually did, because it was not easy, it was not simple labor. Much of it required real skill. Stone cutting is skilled work. You cannot just hit a rock with a hammer. You need to understand the stone. You need to see the natural fracture lines. You need to know how to place your chisel, how to strike it, how to shape a rough block into a precise piece that fits perfectly with the blocks around it. Enslaved workers did this. They were trained, they were skilled, they were as good as the free stonemasons working next to them, but they earned nothing. Carpentry is skilled work too. Framing a building requires understanding structure, load bearing, how to join beams, how to create stairs, how to build floors that will not collapse. Enslaved carpenters did this work. They had the same skills as free carpenters, they just had different legal status. Bricklaying, plastering, painting, all skilled trades, all performed by both free and enslaved workers. The quality of work was the same, the legal treatment was completely different, and the conditions, brutal for everyone. But worse for enslaved workers because they could not quit. Summer in Washington is hot, humid, oppressive, temperatures over 90 degrees. Working in that heat is exhausting, cutting stone in the sun, mixing mortar, hauling materials, no breaks except what the supervisor allowed. Winter in Washington is cold, wet, miserable, mortar will not set properly in freezing temperatures, but work continued anyway. Enslaved workers worked in all weather, they had no choice. The work was also dangerous. Stone blocks were heavy, hundreds of pounds each. Lifting them required muscle and coordination. Drop one and it could crush your foot, crush your hand, kill you. Scaffolding was basic. Wooden platforms tied together, sometimes unstable. Working at height was risky, falls happened, injuries happened. No safety regulations, no workers' compensation. If you got hurt, you were done. If you were enslaved and got hurt, your owner might not even get paid for that month. Records do not tell us how many workers died during construction. Records do not tell us how many were injured. Those details were not considered important enough to write down. The building mattered, the workers did not. By 1800, after 8 years of work, the White House was technically finished, not completely finished. Not perfectly finished, but finished enough that President John Adams could move in. The building stood. Limestone walls, slate roof, windows and doors installed, inside about 30 rooms, some plastered and painted, others still bare. The East Room was completely unfinished, just walls. Abigail Adams used it to hang laundry to dry. The most important room in America's most important house was a laundry room, but the building existed. It could be occupied. The government could move from Philadelphia to Washington. The nation had its capital, and the enslaved workers who built it, they went back to their owners, back to plantations, back to other work, no ceremony for them, no recognition, no payment, just back to bondage. The White House stood as proof of American ambition. American skill, American democracy, but it also stood as proof of American hypocrisy. The building represented freedom while being built by people who had none. This is the truth they did not teach you in school. This is the truth that tour guides skipped. This is the truth America tried to forget. But the truth does not disappear just because you ignore it. The payment records still exist. The evidence is clear. Hundreds of enslaved people built the White House. Their labor was stolen. Their names were erased. Their contribution was forgot for 200 years. Now you know. Now the question is, how did this happen? How did America decide to build its capital using enslaved labor? How did the founders justify this? The answer begins not with construction. It begins with politics. It begins with a deal. A compromise made over dinner in 1790. A compromise that would determine where the capital would be built. And once the location was chosen, the labor system was inevitable. Because the location they chose was between two slave states, Maryland and Virginia, where slavery was legal. Where enslaved workers were available, where using them seemed perfectly normal. The compromise that created Washington, D.C. also guaranteed that enslaved people would build it. That is not a coincidence. That is cause and effect. Let me tell you about that compromise, about the dinner where it happened, about the men who made the deal, about why they chose the Potomac River, about what that choice meant for the hundreds of workers who would build the Capitol. That story starts in 1790. The nation is young, only a few years old, and it has a problem. But how did this happen? How did a nation founded on freedom decide to use enslaved people to build its most important buildings? The answer is not simple. The answer is political. And it starts with a problem that almost tore America apart before it really began. The year is 1790. The United States is only 3 years old. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. George Washington became president in 1789. The government is new. The nation is fragile, and Congress cannot agree on anything, especially one thing: where should the permanent capital be? This might sound like a small issue. It was not. It was huge. Because in 1790, America did not have a permanent capital city. Congress met in different places: New York, Philadelphia, Princeton, New Jersey, even Annapolis, Maryland. The government moved around like a traveling circus. This was embarrassing. Every real nation had a capital: London, Paris, Madrid, but America could not decide. Northern states wanted the capital in the north. Southern states wanted it in the south. Nobody would compromise. The arguments went on for years. Meanwhile, the nation had bigger problems, money problems. The Revolutionary War had ended in 1783, but the war left enormous debts. The federal government owed money. State governments owed money. Nobody knew how to pay it back. The economy was struggling. Something had to be done. Enter Alexander Hamilton. He was Secretary of the Treasury, smart, ambitious, born in the Caribbean, immigrated to America, fought in the Revolution. Now he had a plan to fix the economy. Hamilton's plan was simple in concept. The federal government would assume all state debts, take over what the states owed, then pay it back gradually through taxes and tariffs. This would give the federal government more power. It would create a strong central government. It would establish financial credibility with European lenders, but there was a problem. Southern states hated this plan. Why? Because most southern states had already paid off much of their debt. They did not want to help pay northern debts. Massachusetts owed the most. Virginia had paid most of its debt already. Why should Virginia taxpayers help Massachusetts? Southern congressmen refused to vote for Hamilton's plan. They blocked it. Hamilton could not get the votes he needed. His plan was dying, and if his plan died, America's economy might collapse. Hamilton was desperate. He needed votes. He needed Southern votes. But what could he offer Southerners to change their minds? That is where Thomas Jefferson comes in. He was Secretary of State from Virginia, plantation owner, influential in the South, and he had something Hamilton wanted: Southern political connections. James Madison was also key, congressman from Virginia, close friend of Jefferson, brilliant political mind. He understood both sides. He saw an opportunity. Now here is where it gets interesting. In June 1790, Hamilton ran into Jefferson outside President Washington's house in New York. Hamilton looked terrible, stressed, exhausted. He told Jefferson his financial plan was failing. He needed help. Without it, the Union might fall apart. Jefferson listened. He did not particularly like Hamilton. They disagreed on almost everything. But Jefferson agreed the nation needed financial stability. So he made a suggestion. Come to my house for dinner. Bring Madison. Let us talk. Let us see if we can make a deal. That dinner happened in late June 1790. 3 men, Jefferson's house, wine and food, and a conversation that would change American history. Hamilton explained his problem. He needed Southern votes for his financial plan. Jefferson and Madison explained their problem. The South wanted the permanent capital in the South, not in Philadelphia, not in New York. Somewhere Southern, the deal was obvious. Each side wanted something. Each side could give something. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Politics. Here is what they agreed. Hamilton would get his financial plan. The federal government would assume state debts. Northern states would be happy. Southern congressmen would vote yes. In exchange, the permanent capital would be located in the South. Not far north, not in Pennsylvania, somewhere along the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia, right in the middle of the South. Both sides got what they wanted. Hamilton got his financial system. Jefferson and Madison got their Southern capital. Problem solved. This is called the Compromise of 1790. 1 dinner, 3 men, a deal that shaped America. Congress voted in July 1790. The Residence Act passed. It officially designated a site along the Potomac River as the permanent capital. The exact location would be chosen by President Washington, but it had to be somewhere along the Potomac. That was the law. Now here is what they did not talk about at that dinner. Here is what nobody mentioned. Here is the part that matters for our story. The Potomac River runs between Maryland and Virginia. Both are slave states. Both have large enslaved populations. Both have plantation owners who hire out enslaved workers for extra income. Both have legal systems that support slavery completely. Choosing the Potomac meant choosing slave territory. And building a capital in slave territory meant using enslaved labor. That was not explicitly stated in the compromise, but everyone understood it. It was obvious. If the capital had been placed in Pennsylvania, slavery would have been more complicated. Pennsylvania was gradually abolishing slavery. By 1790, most enslaved people in Pennsylvania had been freed or were on track to be freed. Using enslaved labor there would have been legally difficult, but Maryland and Virginia, no problem. Slavery was fully legal, fully supported, fully normal. Building with enslaved labor would raise no legal questions at all. So the Compromise of 1790 was not just about location. It was about labor, about who would build the capital, about whose work would be paid and whose would be stolen. The dinner deal guaranteed enslaved workers would build Washington, D.C. Maybe Hamilton understood that. Maybe Jefferson and Madison understood that. Maybe none of them cared. Either way, that was the result. Now we need to talk about George Washington, because he played the biggest role of all. The Residence Act gave Washington enormous power. He would choose the exact location. He would select the land. He would appoint commissioners to oversee construction. Basically, he would create the capital however he wanted. Washington knew the Potomac area well, very well. Why? Because he lived there. His plantation, Mount Vernon, was right on the Potomac River, about 15 miles from where the capital would be built. This was his home territory. Washington owned land in the area. He knew the geography, he knew the people, he knew which landowners might sell, he knew where to build. And he knew about the labor supply, because Washington owned over 300 enslaved people. His plantation ran on enslaved labor. He bought enslaved people. He sold enslaved people. He hired out enslaved people when he did not need them. He was completely comfortable with the slavery system. When Washington started planning the capital, he thought about labor the same way he thought about it at Mount Vernon. You need workers. You hire free craftsmen for specialized work. You use enslaved labor for everything else. That is just how things worked. In January 1791, Washington selected the exact site, about 100 square miles along the Potomac. Land from Maryland, land from Virginia, a perfect square diamond shape, right where he wanted it. He appointed 3 commissioners to oversee construction: Daniel Carroll, Thomas Johnson, David Stewart, all wealthy, all from the area, all slave owners. They understood the system, they would use it. Washington also hired Pierre L'Enfant to design the city layout. L'Enfant was French, brilliant designer. He created the street plan, the grand avenues, the public spaces, the locations for important buildings. But L'Enfant was difficult to work with, arrogant, refused to follow instructions. By 1792, Washington fired him. The city plan remained, but L'Enfant was gone. For the president's house specifically, Washington wanted something dignified, important, but not too royal, not like a palace. America was a republic, not a monarchy. The building had to represent Republican values. So in 1792, the commissioners announced a design competition. Prize money, $500 or a medal. Requirements: design a house for the president, make it substantial, make it elegant, make it appropriate for a head of state. But before we talk about that competition, understand what had already been decided. The location was set: Potomac River. Slave territory. The labor system was set: free and enslaved workers, mixed workforce. The funding was limited. The government did not have much money. Using enslaved labor would save thousands of dollars. Everything was in place. All that remained was the design. Someone had to imagine what this building would look like. Someone had to create the vision. And that someone was an Irish immigrant who had never built anything this important in his life. His name was James Hoban. And his design would define the most famous house in America. But here is what you need to understand. By the time Hoban won the competition, the decision to use enslaved labor had already been made. Not officially announced, not written in a public document, but decided nonetheless. Washington knew it. The commissioners knew it. Anyone familiar with construction in Maryland and Virginia knew it. This is how buildings got built in slave states: free craftsmen for skilled work, enslaved laborers for heavy work and supporting tasks, both essential. Only one group paid. The Compromise of 1790 made this inevitable. The dinner deal between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison determined everything that followed. They wanted a Southern capital. They got a Southern capital. And a Southern capital meant Southern labor practices. That meant enslaved workers would cut the stone, would haul the materials, would dig the foundations, would mix the mortar, would build the walls, would create the building. And that meant their labor would be stolen. Their names would not be recorded. Their contributions would be forgotten. All predictable from the moment that compromise was made. Think about the irony. Hamilton's financial plan was supposed to establish American honor, pay back debts, show the world that America keeps its promises. But building the Capitol to house that government, that involved not paying hundreds of workers, stealing their labor, breaking the most basic promise of all: fair payment for honest work. Jefferson talked endlessly about liberty. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Beautiful words, famous words, and then he helped create a capital built partly by enslaved people, people he did not consider equal at all. Washington led the revolution, fought for American freedom, risked his life for independence. And then he approved using people without freedom to build America's most important buildings. The contradiction was massive, but nobody seemed to notice, or nobody seemed to care. This was just normal. This was just how things worked in 1790s America. The Compromise of 1790 solved a political problem. It kept the nation together. It created the capital that still exists today. But it also guaranteed that enslaved workers would build that capital. And it guaranteed that their contributions would be ignored for 200 years. Because acknowledging enslaved workers would mean acknowledging the contradiction. And acknowledging the contradiction would mean questioning the founders, questioning the system, questioning everything America claimed to represent. Easier to just not mention it. Easier to talk about presidents and architects and grand designs. Easier to forget the workers who actually built it. And that is exactly what America did. For 2 centuries, now you know how it happened, a dinner deal, a political compromise, a choice to put the capital in slave territory. And once that choice was made, everything else followed. The mixed workforce, the payment to owners, the stolen labor, the forgotten workers. The Compromise of 1790 created Washington, D.C., but it also created the conditions for one of American history's greatest injustices. An injustice built into the foundation of the Capitol. Literally, enslaved workers dug those foundations, mixed that mortar, cut that stone, their work remains, their names were erased. That is the legacy of the Compromise. That is what the dinner deal really meant. Now we have the location, we have the political deal, we have the labor system already determined. What we need next is the actual design, the building itself, the vision that would become the White House. That is where James Hoban enters the story, an architect from Ireland, a competition winner, a man whose design would be built by hundreds of workers, free and enslaved. A man whose name would be remembered while the workers who executed his vision would be forgotten. Let me tell you about that competition, about Hoban's design, about why it won, and about what it required to actually build it. In March 1792, the commissioners published an advertisement in newspapers up and down the East Coast. They were looking for designs, 2 designs actually. One for the Capitol building where Congress would meet, one for the President's house where the chief executive would live. The requirements were specific but not too detailed. The President's house needed to be substantial, dignified, appropriate for a head of state, but not too elaborate, not too expensive. America was a republic. The building should reflect Republican values, not royal excess. The prize was modest, $500 or a medal worth that amount, not a fortune. But enough to attract attention. Architects from several states submitted proposals, some professional, some amateur, some realistic, some wildly impractical. One submission came from an anonymous designer who signed his entry only with initials. Years later, historians figured out who it was: Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of State himself entered the competition anonymously. Jefferson loved architecture. He designed his own home, Monticello. He studied Roman and Greek buildings. He owned books on classical design. He had strong opinions about what American buildings should look like. His design for the president's house was modest, based on a Roman villa style. Single-story, horizontal, elegant but restrained, very Jeffersonian, very classical. The commissioners rejected it, too small. Too modest? Not impressive enough. The President of the United States needed something more substantial, something that would command respect. Jefferson's design did not do that. Other submissions had different problems. Some were too elaborate, too expensive, too much like European palaces. Some looked like royal residences. That was exactly what Washington did not want. America had fought a war to get rid of kings. The president's house could not look like a king's palace. Some designs were simply impractical, too large for the budget, too complex to build with available materials, too ambitious for the timeline. Remember, the government planned to move to the new capital by 1800. That gave them only 8 years. The design had to be buildable in that time. Then came James Hoban's submission, and everything changed. Hoban was born in Ireland in 1758, County Kilkenny. His family was not wealthy, but Hoban showed talent for drawing and design. He received training at the Dublin Society's drawing school. This was one of the best architecture schools in Ireland. He learned classical design, Georgian style, proportion, symmetry, all the principles of 18th century architecture, but Ireland offered limited opportunities. Like many skilled workers, Hoban looked to America. He immigrated in the 1780s, settled in Charleston, South Carolina, found work as an architect and builder, designed some buildings there, made a reputation, not famous but competent, reliable. When Hoban saw the advertisement for the President's House competition, he recognized an opportunity. Win this and his career would be made. Lose and he was out, only the time spent on drawings. He worked on his design carefully. He based it on Leinster House in Dublin, a grand Georgian building. Irish Parliament met there. Hoban knew it well. He had studied it, drawn it, understood its proportions, but he did not just copy Leinster House. He adapted it, made it appropriate for America, simplified some elements, adjusted the scale, created something that looked dignified but not royal, substantial but not excessive. The design was 3 stories, rectangular, symmetrical, Georgian style with classical details, stone construction, about 170 feet long, 85 feet deep, large enough to be impressive, small enough to be built within budget. The main floor would have the public rooms, east room for large receptions, state dining room for official dinners, several parlors and sitting rooms. The ground floor would have service spaces, kitchens, storage, work areas. The upper floor would have private quarters, bedrooms, family spaces. The exterior would have classical details, columns, pediments, careful proportions, windows evenly spaced, everything balanced, everything harmonious. This was Georgian architecture at its finest, elegant through mathematical precision. Hoban submitted his drawings in July 1792. Washington and the commissioners reviewed all the submissions. They discussed the options, debated the merits of different designs. Washington liked Hoban's design immediately. It had the right feel. Dignified but not pretentious, large but not overwhelming, classical but not too European. It looked like a building for a Republican head of state, not a king, not a dictator, a president. The commissioners agreed. On July 16, 1792, they announced James Hoban as the winner. He would receive the $500 prize. More importantly, he would oversee construction. He would be the architect of the President's House. His design would become the most famous residence in America. Hoban accepted immediately. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. He would move to the new capital, supervise every detail, make sure his vision was built correctly. But winning the competition was the easy part. Now came the hard part, actually building it. The design required enormous amounts of material, stone for the exterior walls. Thousands of stones, each cut precisely, each positioned carefully, timber for the interior structure, floor joists, roof beams, framing, plaster for the walls, paint for the finish, glass for the windows, hardware for the doors. All of this had to be acquired, transported to the site, stored, protected from weather, organized for construction. It was a massive logistical challenge. The stone would come from a quarry at Aquia Creek in Virginia, about 40 miles south of the building site. The stone there was good quality sandstone, light tan color, soft enough to carve, hard enough to be durable. It had been used for other buildings. The quality was proven, but getting stone from quarry to building site was complicated. No railroads existed. Roads were poor. The only practical method was water transport, barges on the Potomac River. This meant the stone had to be quarried, cut into rough blocks, hauled to the river, loaded onto barges, floated 40 miles upstream, unloaded at the building site, then shaped into final form. Every block made this journey, hundreds of blocks. Thousands eventually. The timber would come from local forests. Maryland and Virginia had plenty of trees, oak for framing, pine for boards, massive timbers for the main beams. All of this had to be cut, seasoned, transported, cut again to exact dimensions. Hoban estimated the work would take about 8 years if everything went smoothly. That would barely make the 1800 deadline. Any delays would be a problem, so he needed a large workforce, and he needed it immediately. The commissioners advertised for workers. They offered standard wages for the time. Stonemasons could earn about $3 per week, carpenters about $2 per week, laborers about $1 per week. These were decent wages, enough to attract skilled free workers, and workers did come, mostly immigrants. Scots who had trained as stonemasons in Edinburgh or Glasgow, Irish carpenters who learned their trade in Dublin or Cork, some English workers, some Americans, not enough but a start. But the commissioners knew free labor alone would not be sufficient. The project was too big, the timeline too tight, the budget too limited. They needed more workers, cheaper workers, they needed enslaved workers. This was not controversial, this was not debated, this was simply understood. In Maryland and Virginia, large construction projects used enslaved labor. Always, it was normal, expected, economical. So the commissioners began hiring enslaved workers from local farmers. The system was simple. A farmer who owned enslaved people would hire them out. The government would pay the farmer a monthly rate. Usually $5 per month per worker. The farmer kept the money. The worker got nothing. From the government's perspective, this was economical. $5 per month was much cheaper than paying free workers $2 to $3 per week. An enslaved worker cost about $60 per year. A free worker cost over $100 per year. Using enslaved labor cut labor costs almost in half. From the farmer's perspective, this was profitable. They owned enslaved people anyway. Hiring them out generated extra income. If they did not need all their enslaved workers for farm work during certain seasons, this was easy money. From the enslaved workers' perspective, this was just more bondage, more work. No choice, no compensation, just orders and labor. By late 1792, both types of workers were arriving at the building site. Free craftsmen and enslaved laborers, the mixed workforce that would build the White House. Holbein organized them carefully. Free workers handled the most skilled tasks. Stone cutting required precision. Each block had to fit exactly. Free stonemasons from Scotland did this work. They had years of training. They understood stone. They could shape a block perfectly, but moving those blocks, that was heavy labor. Enslaved workers did that, hauling stones from the barges to the building site, lifting them into position, holding them while masons adjusted the placement. Hard, physical work. Carpentry followed the same pattern. Free carpenters designed and cut the major joints, the complex work. The structural elements that had to be perfect. Enslaved workers assisted, cut simple boards, moved timber, held pieces while carpenters secured them. This system was efficient from a construction standpoint. Skilled free workers focused on quality. Enslaved workers provided the muscle. The building rose steadily, but the human cost was enormous. Enslaved workers worked the same hours as free workers, dawn to dusk, 6 days per week, but free workers could quit if they wanted. Could negotiate for better pay, could take a day off if they were sick. Enslaved workers had no such options. They worked when ordered, they could not negotiate, could not quit, could not refuse, they were property. Property does not get choices, and the work was dangerous for everyone. Stone blocks were heavy. Drop one on your foot and bones break. Scaffolding was rickety, fall from 20 feet and you might die. Tools were sharp, chisels, saws, axes. Injuries were common, but if a free worker got injured, he could go home, recover, come back when healed. If an enslaved worker got injured, his owner might not get paid for that time. The owner would be angry, the worker would be blamed, and when he recovered, he would be worked even harder to make up for lost time. Holbein supervised all of this. He focused on the building, on making sure his design was executed correctly, on keeping the project on schedule. The human dynamics of the mixed workforce, that was just how things were. He did not question it. Nobody did. By the end of 1792, the foundation was being laid. Massive stone foundation. Deep and solid, this building had to last, had to support 3 stories of stone and timber. The foundation took months, required enormous amounts of stone, required dozens of workers, free and enslaved. By 1793, the walls were beginning to rise, slowly, carefully, each stone positioned, each course checked for level, the building emerging block by block, free stonemasons cutting, enslaved laborers moving, hour after hour, day after day, month after month. Hoban's design was becoming real. The vision on paper was becoming stone and timber. The most important house in America was taking shape, but it was taking shape through stolen labor, through unpaid work, through a system that valued the building more than the people building it. James Hoban's name would be remembered. His design would be famous. Every history book would mention him, every tour guide would credit him. The enslaved workers who actually executed his design, who cut the stone, who moved the blocks, who made the vision real, their names would not be recorded. Their contributions would be ignored. They would be forgot. That is the truth of the president's house. Beautiful design, famous architect, and hundreds of anonymous workers whose labor was stolen. Now the building was designed. The architect was hired. The workforce was assembled. The construction was beginning. What happened next? How did they actually build it? What did those workers do day after day for 8 years? Let me show you the construction process, the actual work, the techniques, the challenges. The slow, difficult progress of building America's most famous house with 18th century tools and mixed free and enslaved labor. October 13, 1792. The day construction officially began. A ceremony marked the occasion. Commissioners present, local officials present, James Hoban present, and the workers, both groups, free craftsmen in one area, enslaved laborers in another, both essential, both necessary, both about to spend years building the same structure. Let me tell you exactly who these workers were, what they did, how they were treated, because this is where the story becomes most uncomfortable. This is where theory becomes reality, where political decisions become human consequences. The free workers came from many places. Scotland sent stonemasons. Men trained in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Men who understood stone the way musicians understand notes. They could look at a block and see the finished shape inside, could place a chisel exactly right, strike it precisely, split stone along natural fracture lines. These Scottish masons were proud of their work, proud of their skill. They commanded respect because they had earned it through years of training, apprenticeships that started in childhood, learning from masters, practicing for decades. By the time they came to America, they were experts. Ireland sent carpenters, men from Dublin and Cork who knew timber like the Scots knew stone, could frame a building so solid it would stand for centuries, could cut joints that fit perfectly without nails, could shape wood into stairs, doors, window frames. Functional art, some English craftsmen came too, plasterers, painters, specialists in finishing work, the details that turned raw construction into refined architecture. These were skilled trades, respected trades. Men who did this work earned decent money and social standing. The Americans among the free workers were similar, trained craftsmen. Some learned trades from European fathers, some apprenticed with colonial masters, all skilled, all capable. All there by choice and all paid weekly wages. A stonemason might earn $3 per week, about $150 per year, in today's money roughly $5,000, not a fortune, but decent money for the time, enough to support a family, enough to save a little, enough to build a future. They worked hard for that money, dawn to dusk, 6 days per week, physical labor, demanding labor, but they chose it. They could quit if they wanted, could negotiate for better pay, could move to another job. They had agency, they had rights, they had freedom. Now let me tell you about the other group, the enslaved workers. They came from farms and plantations in Maryland and Virginia. Their owners hired them out to the federal government. The system was simple and legal and completely normal for that time and place. A government clerk would visit local farms, ask if the owner had enslaved workers available, negotiate a monthly rate, usually $5 per month per worker, write up a contract. The owner would send the workers, the government would pay the owner, the workers got nothing. The payment records still exist in the National Archives, ledger after ledger, entry after entry. Paid to Mr. Blagden for hire of 3 Negroes 1 month $15. Paid to Mr. Williams for hire of 5 Negro laborers 1 month $25. Paid to estate of Daniel Carroll for hire of Negro Tom 1 month $5. The records list the owners clearly, the amounts precisely, but the workers, rarely named, usually just described as Negroes or Negro laborers or hired slaves, not people, property, rented property. Occasionally a first name appears. Negro Ben, Negro Daniel, Negro Peter. First name only, no last name, no biographical information, no details, just enough identification to distinguish one worker from another if there was a problem. Let me give you specific examples. Real people. Real records. In 1794, the government paid a man named William Blagden for hire of Negro labor. Blagden owned several enslaved people. He hired them out regularly, made good money from it. The records show multiple payments over several years. Hundreds of dollars total. The workers themselves, we do not even know their names. In 1795, the commissioners paid Daniel Carroll's estate for an enslaved man named Tom. Tom worked on the president's house for at least a year, maybe longer. We know his first name because he was listed individually in one record, but his last name, unknown, his age, unknown, his skills, unknown, everything about him except that he worked and earned nothing. In 1796, a man named Notley Young received payment for multiple enslaved workers. The record says hire of Negro carpenters, plural, at least 2, possibly more. These were skilled workers, trained carpenters, as capable as the free Irish carpenters working beside them, but they earned nothing while their owner collected their wages. This happened hundreds of times, month after month, year after year. Different owner, different workers, same system, payment to owners, nothing to workers. Now let me tell you what these enslaved workers actually did. Because there is a myth that needs to be destroyed. The myth that enslaved workers only did unskilled labor, only hauling and digging, only simple, mindless work. That is false, completely false. Many enslaved workers were highly skilled. They had been trained as carpenters, as stonemasons, as blacksmiths, as plasterers. Their owners recognized that skilled workers were more valuable, could be hired out for more money. So some owners invested in training, taught enslaved people valuable trades. This created a contradiction. An enslaved carpenter might be as skilled as a free carpenter, might do exactly the same work, might produce exactly the same quality. But he earned nothing while the free carpenter earned $2 per week. They worked side by side, the free Irish carpenter and the enslaved American carpenter. Both cutting joints, both framing walls, both building the same structure. One man paid, one man unpaid, both necessary. The same was true for stonemasons. Some enslaved workers had been trained in stonecutting, could shape a block as well as the Scottish masons, could understand the stone, could see the fracture lines, could place the chisel perfectly. These skilled enslaved workers were valuable. Their owners could charge more for them. Instead of $5 per month, maybe $7 or $8 for a skilled carpenter. The owner benefited. The government got skilled labor cheaper than hiring free workers. The enslaved worker got nothing, but most enslaved workers did heavy labor, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked opportunity for training, and because heavy labor was always needed. Quarrying stone is brutal work. The stone came from Aquia Creek, 40 miles south. Workers at the quarry cut blocks from the earth, used wedges and hammers, split massive pieces of sandstone, shaped them roughly, prepared them for transport. Some of those quarry workers were enslaved, working in heat, in cold, in rain, cutting stone day after day, breathing stone dust, risking crushed hands and broken bones for no wages. The stone blocks were heavy, some weighed several hundred pounds. Moving them required muscle and coordination. Teams of workers, ropes and levers, careful positioning. One mistake and the block could fall, could crush someone. Enslaved workers did this. Moved blocks from quarry to barge, loaded them carefully, unloaded them at the building site, hauled them to where masons needed them. Backbreaking work, dangerous work, unpaid work. Mixing mortar seems simple. It is not. The proportions must be exact. Too much lime and it is too strong, cracks when it dries. Too little and it is too weak, does not hold. Mixing by hand requires understanding the material, recognizing when the consistency is right. Enslaved workers mixed mortar, thousands of batches, day after day, got good at it, understood it. Their skill made the building possible, but their skill was not valued, not compensated, just expected. Hauling materials was constant. Stone from barges to building, timber from storage to construction site, water for mortar, bricks, tools. Everything had to be moved by hand. No machines. No trucks, just human muscle. Enslaved workers did most of this, walking back and forth, carrying heavy loads all day, every day, wearing out their bodies, building their owner's income, receiving nothing themselves. The working conditions were harsh for everyone, but worse for enslaved workers because they could not object, could not complain, could not refute. Summer in Washington is brutal, temperatures over 90 degrees, humidity oppressive. Working in that heat is exhausting, cutting stone, mixing mortar, hauling materials, sweat pouring, drinking water constantly. No air conditioning, no fans, just heat. Free workers could slow down when overheated, could take breaks, could even take a day off if they were too sick. Enslaved workers. They worked unless they physically collapsed. Their comfort did not matter, only their productivity. Winter was different but equally hard. Cold, wet, mortar does not set properly in freezing temperatures, but work continued anyway. Projects had deadlines. The government wanted the building finished by 1800. No time for weather delays. Free workers could wear warm clothes, could go home to heated houses at night. Enslaved workers often had inadequate clothing, lived in basic shelters, suffered in the cold, and the work was dangerous. Construction is always dangerous, but 18th century construction was especially risky. No safety regulations, no protective equipment, no workers' compensation. Stone blocks were heavy. Drop one and it could crush a foot, crush a hand, kill someone. Scaffolding was wooden planks tied together, sometimes stable, sometimes not. Fall from a scaffold and you might die. At minimum, you would break bones. Tools were dangerous. Sharp chisels, saws with no guards, axes, hammers. One moment of inattention and you could cut yourself badly. Infection was common. Antibiotics did not exist. A bad cut could kill you. The records do not tell us how many workers died during construction, do not tell us how many were seriously injured. Those details were not considered important enough to document. The building mattered, the workers were replaceable, but we know injuries happened, we know deaths happened. It was inevitable given the conditions and the timeline and the pressure to finish. If a free worker died, there was some compensation, maybe. His family might receive something, maybe a few weeks' wages, maybe nothing. But at least people acknowledged he had died. If an enslaved worker died, his owner might sue the government for the value of lost property. That is not an exaggeration. That actually happened. The owner had lost an asset. The owner wanted compensation. The worker's family, they got nothing, not even acknowledgement. Let me give you the numbers again so you understand the scale. At least 400 enslaved workers were involved at different times during the 8 years of construction. Some worked for a few months, some for years. They were not all there simultaneously. The workforce size varied. Maybe 50 workers on site at slow times, maybe 100 or more during peak construction. At any given time, roughly half were free workers, half were enslaved, both groups essential, both doing similar work, both building the same structure, but treated completely differently under law. The free workers earned approximately $100 to $150 per year depending on skill level. The enslaved workers earned zero. Their owners earned $60 per year per worker. The government saved thousands of dollars by using enslaved labor instead of hiring more free workers. In total, the government probably saved over $100,000 in $1,800 by using enslaved labor. That is roughly $3 million in today's money. Half the construction cost came from unpaid labor, stolen labor. Think about what that means. The White House cost $232,000 to build, but the true cost was higher. If all workers had been paid fairly, the cost would have been over $300,000. The government chose to use enslaved labor specifically to reduce costs. This was not accidental. This was intentional economic policy, and it worked. From the government's perspective, it worked perfectly. The building got built. The costs stayed manageable. The deadline was almost met. Success, from the enslaved workers' perspective. Their labor was stolen, their contributions were ignored, their names were not recorded, and when the building was finished they received nothing, not money, not recognition, not freedom, nothing. They went back to their owners, back to plantations, back to farms, back to bondage, as if nothing had happened, as if they had not just built the most important house in America. The free workers at least had the satisfaction of accomplishment. They could tell people they built the president's house, could point to it with pride, could include it on their resumes, could build reputations. The enslaved workers could not even do that. Their work was anonymous, their contribution unacknowledged. They built the house, but the house did not belong to them in any way, not even in memory. This is the reality of the workforce that built the White House. Free and enslaved, skilled and unskilled, paid and unpaid, working together, treated differently, building the same symbol of American democracy. Now you know who the workers were, now you know how they were treated. Next, let me show you what they actually built. The physical process, the techniques. The slow, difficult work of raising walls and framing floors and creating the structure that would become the White House. October 1792, the site is ready. The workers are assembled, the materials are starting to arrive. James Hoban has his drawings, the commissioners have their timeline. 8 years to build the president's house. 8 years to create the most important residence in America. Now comes the actual work, the real construction, stone by stone, timber by timber, day by day. Let me show you exactly how they built it. First, the ground had to be prepared. The site was not level. Natural terrain is never perfectly flat. Hills and valleys, slopes and depressions. Before any building could rise, the ground had to be graded. Enslaved workers did most of this. Shovels and picks, wheelbarrow, moving dirt by hand. Cutting into hills, filling low areas, creating a level platform for the foundation. Weeks of work, maybe months, just preparing the site. Then came the most critical part. The foundation. Everything depended on the foundation. If it failed, the entire building would fail. If it settled unevenly, walls would crack, floors would slope, doors would not close. The foundation had to be perfect. Hoban designed a massive stone foundation. Deep, solid, capable of supporting 3 stories of stone and timber. The foundation would go down 30 feet in some places. This was serious engineering. Workers dug the foundation trenches by hand. No backhoes, no excavators, just men with shovels, digging through soil, hitting rock, breaking rock, digging deeper, day after day. The trenches had to be exact, the right depth, the right width, the right angles. Surveying was done with basic instruments, strings and stakes, measuring carefully, checking constantly. Any error in the foundation would multiply as the building rose. Once the trenches were ready, the stone work began. Large blocks of Aquia Creek sandstone, positioned carefully, mortared together, each course level, each block solid. The foundation rose slowly from the bottom of the trenches. This work required both free and enslaved labor. Free stonemasons checked the positioning, made sure everything was level, made sure the mortar was right. Enslaved workers moved the blocks, held them in position, mixed mortar, carried materials. The foundation took over a year, just the foundation. By the end of 1793, it was finally complete, solid, level, ready to support the building. Now the walls could rise. The exterior walls would be solid stone, Aquia Creek sandstone, each block cut to specific dimensions, each positioned precisely. These walls had to be strong, had to last centuries, had to support the roof, had to resist weather. The stone arrived as rough blocks cut at the quarry into approximate shapes, but the final shaping happened on site. This is where the skilled stonemasons did their work. A stonemason would examine a block, see where it needed to go in the wall, understand what shape it needed to be. Then he would mark it with chalk, lines showing where to cut, where to shape, where to smooth. Then came the careful work, chisel and hammer, tap, 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 not hard blows, controlled strikes. Following the chalk lines, following the natural structure of the stone, shaping the block gradually. This took time. A single block might take hours to shape properly, but it had to be right, had to fit exactly with the blocks around it, had to be level, had to be square, no shortcuts. Some of this work was done by enslaved stonemasons. Men who had been trained, who understood stone, who could shape a block as well as the Scottish mason. They worked side by side. The free Scot and the enslaved American, both skilled, both precise, one paid, one not. Once shaped, the blocks had to be positioned. This required teamwork. Stone blocks were heavy, 200 pounds, 300 pounds, sometimes more. No one person could lift them. Teams of workers used ropes and levers. Wooden scaffolding provided platforms at different heights. The blocks were lifted carefully, positioned exactly, mortar spread underneath. The block lowered into place, checked for level, adjusted if necessary. Then the mortar would set and the block would be permanent. Enslaved workers did much of the heavy lifting. The positioning, the adjusting, under direction from stonemasons, dangerous work. Drop a block and someone could die, but the work continued, block after block, course after course. The walls rose. By 1794, the walls were several feet high. By 1795, they were reaching the first floor level. By 1796, they were approaching the second floor. Slow progress, steady progress. The building was taking shape. Inside the stone shell, timber framing was happening simultaneously. The building needed interior structure. Floor joists, wall studs, roof beams, all wood, all precisely cut and fitted. This was the carpenter's work. Free carpenters and enslaved carpenters working together, creating the skeleton that would support floors and ceilings and interior walls. The main beams were massive, oak timbers, a foot thick, 20 feet long, heavy. These had to be lifted into position, secured with mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs driven through to lock them in place. No nails in the main structural joints, just precise carpentry. Floor joists ran between the main beams, smaller timbers but still substantial, spaced evenly, creating the framework for floors. Carpenters measured carefully, cut precisely. Every joist had to be right. The enslaved carpenters who did this work were skilled, had been trained, could cut a mortise joint as well as anyone, could see how the structure fit together, could do the math in their heads, calculating angles, calculating loads. Understanding engineering instinctively, but they earned nothing. Their skill was their owner's asset. Their labor was their owner's income. They were tools, valuable tools, but tools nonetheless. By 1796, the interior framing was well advanced. The building was starting to feel like a building. You could walk through it, could see where rooms would be, could imagine the finished structure, but there was still enormous work remaining. The roof, the windows, the doors, the plaster, the paint. All the details that turn a shell into a house. The roof was a major engineering challenge. It had to span the entire building, had to support slate tiles, had to resist wind and rain and snow, had to last. Carpenters built massive roof trusses, triangular frameworks of timber, very strong, very stable. These were assembled on the ground first, then lifted into position. Multiple workers pulling ropes, coordinating carefully, raising the trusses into place. Once the trusses were up, roof boards went on, then waterproofing, then batten, then the slate tiles, imported from Wales, expensive but durable. A slate roof would last a century or more. Roofers did this specialized work, climbing on scaffolding, working at dangerous heights, positioning each tile carefully, securing it. Making sure water would run off properly, making sure no leaks would develop. Some of this work was done by free workers, some by enslaved workers. At that height, everyone was at risk. Fall from the roof and you would probably die, but the work had to be done. The building had to be weathertight. Windows were another major task. The design called for many windows. Large windows, glass was expensive, each pane had to be imported, carefully transported, installed precisely. Window frames were built by carpenters, wood frames that fit into openings in the stone wall. These had to be weathertight, had to be square, had to hold the glass properly. The glass was installed by glaziers, specialists, each pane cut to size, set in putty, secured carefully. This was delicate work. Glass broke easily. Every broken pane was expensive to replace. By 1797, windows were going in. The building was starting to look finished from outside. Stone walls complete. Roof on, windows installed. From a distance, it looked like a completed building, but inside, enormous work remained. Plasterwork, painting. finishing all the details that make a building livable. Plaster covered the interior walls, layers of plaster, first coat rough, second coat smoother, final coat perfectly smooth. This was skilled work. Plasterers knew their material, knew how to mix it, how to apply it, how to create smooth surfaces. Some free plasterers did this work. Some enslaved workers assisted, mixing plaster, carrying materials, holding boards while plasterers worked, supporting the skilled workers. The East Room was the largest space, 40 feet by 80 feet, enormous for the time. This room alone took months to plaster. The ceiling was especially difficult. Plastering overhead is exhausting, arms aching, neck strained, but it had to be perfect. This would be the most important room in the house. Painting came after plaster. Interior walls, woodwork, trim, multiple coats, creating a finished appearance. By 1798, the building was nearing completion. Most rooms were plastered, many were painted. The structure was weathertight, but finishing details continued. Hardware, locks, hinges, mantles, all the elements that complete a house. The timeline was tight. The government planned to move from Philadelphia in 1800. That meant the president's house had to be ready, habitable. Functional, James Hoban pushed the workers, more hours, faster pace. The deadline was approaching. Work continued through 1799, through early 1800, rushing to finish. But let me tell you what this rush meant for workers, especially enslaved workers. Longer days, more pressure, less care for safety, more injuries. More exhaustion. Free workers could refuse excessive demands, could walk off the job if pushed too hard. Enslaved workers had no such option, work or be punished. Work until you drop, no choice. By November 1800, the building was barely ready, not completely finished, not perfectly finished, but habitable. The president could move in. The house could function. 8 years of work, hundreds of workers, free and enslaved, skilled and unskilled, all contributing, all essential. Creating the structure that stands today, let me give you a sense of scale. The building required thousands of stone blocks, each cut by hand, each positioned carefully, hundreds of timber beams, each shaped precisely, each fitted exactly, thousands of square feet of plaster, applied by hand, smoothed by hand. Painted by hand, every inch of the building represents human labor. Hands cutting stone, hands mixing mortar, hands lifting timber, hands applying plaster. Some of those hands belonged to free workers who earned wages. Many belonged to enslaved workers who earned nothing. The total cost was $232,372. About half of that went to materials. Stone, timber, glass, slate, hardware. About half went to labor. But remember, half the labor was unpaid. The enslaved workers received nothing. Their owners received about $60 per year per worker. The government saved enormously by using enslaved labor. If all workers had been paid fairly at free labor rates, the building would have cost over $300,000, maybe $350,000. The government chose enslaved labor specifically to save money. This was intentional. This was policy, and it worked. The building got built on budget, almost on time. From the government's perspective, this was success, efficient use of resources, good management, mission accomplished. But think about what that success meant. It meant hundreds of workers had their labor stolen, had their contributions ignored, had their names erased. They built the most famous house in America and received nothing, not payment, not recognition, not even acknowledgement. The building stands today. The same stone walls, many of the same timber beams, the structure those workers created. Their work is permanent, their names are lost. By November 1800, President John Adams was ready to move in. The second president, the first to live in the president's house. The building was not finished. But it was ready enough. Adams and his wife Abigail would be the first residents. What they found was a house that was both impressive and incomplete. Grand public rooms, but many details unfinished. Plaster not done everywhere, paint not complete. The East Room was just bare walls. Abigail would use it to dry laundry. The first family would live in a construction site. Workers would continue working while the president lived upstairs. Awkward, uncomfortable, but necessary. The government had to move, the building had to be occupied, ready or not, and the enslaved workers who built it. They were already gone, sent back to their owners, back to farms, back to plantations, back to bondage. Their work on the president's house was done. They had received nothing, not wages, not thanks. Not freedom, nothing. They had built the house, but the house did not belong to them, not even in memory. November 1, 1800. John Adams arrived in Washington, the second president of the United States, the first to live in the new capital, the first to occupy the president's house. He came from Philadelphia, where the government had been meeting temporarily. Now the permanent capital was ready, sort of. Adams was 65 years old. Had been president since 1797. Had served as vice president under Washington before that, was one of the founding fathers, signed the Declaration of Independence, helped negotiate peace with Britain, spent his entire adult life building America. Now he would live in the house that represented America, the house built partly by enslaved people. The house that symbolized both American achievement and American contradiction. The journey from Philadelphia took several days. Roads were rough, weather was cold. When Adams finally saw the president's house, he must have had mixed feelings. The building looked impressive from outside. 3 stories, stone walls, slate roof, windows reflecting the sky. It looked finished, but inside was a different story. The building was barely habitable. Only 6 rooms were truly ready, had plaster on the walls. Had paint, had fireplaces that worked. The rest, construction zones, bare walls, unfinished floors, workers still there, still working. Adams moved in anyway. He had no choice. The government had officially relocated to Washington. Congress would meet in the partially finished Capitol building. The president had to live in the president's house. Ready or not, Abigail Adams arrived 2 weeks later. November 16, 1800, she had been visiting family in Massachusetts. Now she came to join her husband in the new capital. She traveled by carriage, got lost several times. The new city barely existed, few buildings, fewer roads, muddy paths through forest. She finally found the president's house after asking directions multiple times. Her first impression was not good. She wrote letters to her family. Those letters survive. They tell us exactly what the house was like in November 1800. Cold, drafty, uncomfortable, unfinished. The house is made habitable, she wrote, but there is not a single apartment finished. She exaggerated slightly. 6 rooms were finished, but her point was valid. Most of the house was not ready. Not for living, not for entertaining, not for anything. The biggest problem was the East Room. This was supposed to be the grandest space, the room for major receptions, for entertaining foreign diplomats, for important events. 40 feet by 80 feet, high ceilings, large windows. It should have been magnificent. Instead, it was empty. Just bare walls, bare floor, no plaster, no paint, no furniture, nothing. The room was useless. Abigail looked at this enormous empty space and made a practical decision. She hung ropes across it, used it to dry laundry. The most important room in America's most important house became a laundry room. That tells you everything about the state of the building in 1800. The fireplaces were another problem. Many did not work properly. The chimneys had been built quickly. Some had structural issues. They smoked, sent smoke into rooms instead of up and out, made rooms unlivable, made eyes water, made breathing difficult in November, in winter, with no central heating. Fireplaces were essential. If they did not work, you froze. Adams and Abigail had to figure out which rooms had working fireplaces. Live in those rooms, avoid the others. The windows leaked. Cold air came through gaps around the frames. The building had been built too quickly. Details had been rushed. Weatherproofing was incomplete. Wind whistled through the house, made it feel even colder. Abigail wrote, "We have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience without, and the great unfinished audience room I make a drying room of to hang up the clothes in." She was frustrated. This was the president's house, the symbol of America, and she was hanging laundry in the main reception room. But here is what Abigail did not mention in her letters, did not think about, did not consider worth mentioning: the enslaved workers who built this uncomfortable, unfinished house. The hundreds of men who cut the stone, who laid the floors, who built the chimneys that now smoked, who installed the windows that now leaked. She complained about the building, but she never mentioned the builders, never wondered who had done the work, never asked if they had been paid. To her, the building simply existed. How it got built was not relevant. This was normal. This was how people thought in 1800. Buildings appeared, workers were invisible, especially enslaved workers. They were not people to think about, they were part of the system, like tools, like material. Meanwhile, construction continued. Workers were still on site, free craftsmen and enslaved laborers, still plastering walls, still painting, still installing hardware, still finishing details. Working around the president and first lady, awkward for everyone. Imagine being an enslaved worker in December 1800. You are plastering a wall in the president's house. The president is living upstairs. You can hear him walking around, talking to visitors, conducting the nation's business. And you are downstairs, working without wages, building his house, knowing you will never be acknowledged, never be thanked, never be paid. The contradiction must have been obvious, even if nobody talked about it. The symbol of freedom being finished by people without freedom. The house of American democracy being completed by people denied all democratic rights, but work continued, day after day. The building had to be finished, details had to be completed. Timeline or no timeline, there was still work to do. Adams did not live in the president's house very long, only 4 months. He had run for re-election in 1800, lost to Thomas Jefferson. The election was contentious, bitter. Adams took it hard. He left Washington on March 4, 1801, the morning of Jefferson's inauguration. Did not stay for the ceremony, did not meet with Jefferson, just left. He had lived in the president's house from November 1800 to March 1801. 4 months, the shortest residency of any president. The building was still unfinished when he left, still had workers, still had incomplete rooms. He never got to live in a finished house. Thomas Jefferson moved in on March 4, 1801, the third president, the second to live in the president's house. The man who had written the Declaration of Independence, the man who had helped choose the location for the Capitol, the man who owned over 600 enslaved people at his plantation Monticello. Jefferson saw the unfinished house as an opportunity. He loved architecture, had designed Monticello himself, had studied classical buildings, had opinions about everything related to construction and design. Now he could shape the president's house to his vision. He immediately started making changes. The building needed work anyway, might as well improve it while finishing it. Jefferson designed additions, east and west terraces, covered walkways, service spaces. He expanded the functional areas, made the house more practical, and he continued using the same labor system. Government hired enslaved workers from local owners. Paid the owners, workers received nothing. Same system Adams had used, same system Washington had approved, completely normal. Jefferson saw no contradiction. He wrote eloquently about liberty, about freedom, about human rights, and he owned 600 enslaved people, used enslaved labor at Monticello. Used enslaved labor at the president's house. Never saw the problem, never questioned the system, or if he questioned it privately, he never acted on those questions. He benefited from slavery. His wealth depended on slavery. His lifestyle depended on slavery. Questioning the system would have required changing his life. He was not willing to do that, so enslaved workers continued building and finishing the president's house through Jefferson's entire presidency. 1801 to 1809, 8 years, the same length of time as the original construction, because there was always more work, more improvements, more modifications. The East Room finally got plastered during Jefferson's presidency. Took years, was finally usable for events, no more laundry drying, actual receptions, actual entertaining. The room became what it was supposed to be, but it took until 1807, 7 years after the building was first occupied. Other rooms were finished gradually, painted, furnished, made livable. The house became more comfortable, more functional, more appropriate for a head of state. Jefferson made sure of that, but the workforce remained mixed. Free and enslaved, paid and unpaid, working together, building together, treated differently. The system continued. Nobody questioned it. Nobody challenged it. It was just how things were. Let me give you specific examples from Jefferson's presidency. Real payment records, real enslaved workers. In 1803, the government paid a man named William O'Neill for hire of Negro laborers. Plural, at least 2. working on the president's house grounds. Landscaping probably, or maintenance. The workers were not named, just Negro laborers. They earned nothing. O'Neill collected their wages. In 1804, payment went to someone named Young for hire of 2 Negro carpenters. 2 skilled workers, trained carpenters, doing finish work inside the house. As skilled as any free carpenter but earning nothing, while Young collected $10 per month for both of them. In 1805, more payments for Negro labor. Multiple entries. Multiple workers month after month. The system operated continuously. The records are clear, the evidence is documented. This was not hidden, this was official policy. Jefferson himself sometimes brought enslaved workers from Monticello to work at the president's house, his own property, working on government projects. He would charge the government the standard rate, $5 per month per worker. He would collect the money. The workers would receive nothing. This was perfectly legal, perfectly normal. The president hiring out his own enslaved workers to the government, paying himself with government funds for their labor. Nobody questioned it. It was just business. By 1809, when Jefferson left office, the president's house was finally mostly finished. The major rooms were complete. The East Room was functional. The state dining room was ready. The private quarters were livable. It had taken 17 years from groundbreaking to completion. 1792 to 1809, most of that time using enslaved labor. James Madison became the 4th president in 1809, the 3rd to live in the president's house. He moved in with his wife Dolly. The house was finally in good condition, finally fully functional, finally what it was supposed to be. Madison and Dolly entertained frequently, used the state dining room, used the East Room, hosted diplomats and congressmen and important visitors. The house became the social center of Washington, the place where decisions were made, where politics happened, and nobody mentioned the enslaved workers who had built it. Nobody talked about the unpaid labor. Nobody acknowledged the contradiction. The house was just there, beautiful, impressive, functional. How it got built was forgotten, or ignored, or considered irrelevant. The workers had been sent back to their owners years earlier, back to plantations, back to farms. Their contribution was over. Their work was done, they had received nothing, and now they were forgot. The house stood, the workers were invisible. That was America in the early 1800s. Buildings mattered, people did not, at least not enslaved people. They were tools, property, not worth remembering, but the building remembered them. Every stone block cut by enslaved hands, every timber beam positioned by enslaved workers, every wall plastered with help from enslaved laborers. The building was physical evidence of their work, even if nobody acknowledged it. The president's house stood as a symbol of America, democracy, freedom, opportunity, but it also stood as evidence of America's greatest shame. Slavery, stolen labor, denied humanity, forgotten people, both were true, both were part of the building's story. But for 200 years, America only told half the story. The impressive half, the proud half, the comfortable half, the other half buried, ignored, forgot, until the building burned, until British soldiers came with torches, until everything changed in one night in August 1814. Then the house would have to be rebuilt, and the same enslaved workers who built it the first time would build it again, with the same lack of payment, the same lack of recognition, the same invisible contribution. But that story comes next. The fire, the destruction, the rebuilding, and the white paint that would give the building its famous name. All of it built again with stolen labor. All of it forgotten again for 2 centuries. For 14 years, the president's house stood as America's most important building. Symbol of democracy, symbol of the young nation's ambitions, home to Presidents Adams, Jefferson, and Madison. The building that hundreds of workers, free and enslaved, had spent years constructing. Then in one night it almost disappeared. The year was 1814. America was at war again, the War of 1812. America versus Britain again. The Revolutionary War had ended only 31 years earlier. Now the 2 nations were fighting once more, over shipping rights. Over British interference with American trade, over national pride. The war was not going well for America. British forces were experienced, well-trained, well-equipped. They had been fighting Napoleon in Europe for years. American forces were smaller, less experienced, less prepared. By summer 1814, Napoleon had been defeated in Europe. Britain could now focus entirely on America, could send more troops, more ships, more resources, and Britain wanted revenge for something specific. In April 1813, American forces had attacked York, that is Toronto today, the capital of Upper Canada, British territory. American troops burned government buildings there, burned the Parliament building, destroyed official records. This was considered a war crime by British standards. Britain decided to respond. If Americans burned the Canadian capital, British forces would burn the American capital. Eye for an eye, revenge, a message. In August 1814, a British fleet sailed into Chesapeake Bay. Thousands of troops, commanded by Major General Robert Ross, their objective was clear: march to Washington, destroy government buildings. Humiliate America. American forces tried to stop them. On August 24, 1814, the two armies met at Bladensburg, Maryland, just a few miles from Washington. The Americans had about 6,000 troops, mostly militia, poorly trained, poorly equipped. The British had about 4,500 troops, professional soldiers, veterans. The battle was a disaster for America. The American lines broke almost immediately. Soldiers fled, ran, panicked. It became known as the Bladensburg races because the Americans ran so fast. Within hours, the battle was over. British victory. The road to Washington was open. President Madison had gone to Bladensburg to observe the battle, to encourage the troops. When he saw the American lines collapse, he realized the capital was lost. He rode back to Washington, told his wife Dolly to evacuate, to save what she could. Then he fled. The President of the United States abandoned his capital. Dolly Madison acted with remarkable courage. Most people were already fleeing, packing what they could carry, running, but Dolly stayed as long as possible. She had a mission: save important documents, save national treasure. She gathered papers, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, important letters, official documents. She ordered servants to take them to safety. Then she remembered the painting, Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, full length, life-size, one of the most important pieces of American art. The painting hung in the state dining room, in a heavy frame, screwed to the wall. Dolly ordered it removed. But there was no time to unscrew the frame properly. She told them to break it, smash the frame, get the canvas out, save the painting. They broke the frame, removed the canvas, rolled it carefully, gave it to trusted people who would take it to safety. That painting survives today, hangs in the East Room of the White House, saved because Dolly Madison refused to leave without it. Finally, late afternoon on August 24th, Dolly left. The British were coming. She could hear reports of their approach. She fled the president's house, left everything else behind, but she had saved what mattered most: documents, history, Washington's portrait. British troops entered Washington that evening. August 24, 1814. The city was nearly empty. Most residents had fled. Government officials were gone. Streets were quiet, eerie, a capital abandoned by its own people. The British went straight to the president's house, found it unlocked, empty. They walked through the rooms, saw the furniture, the paintings still on the walls, the luxury, the comfort. In the state dining room, they found something surprising. Dinner was set. The table was laid for 40 people. Food was ready, wine was out. The Madisons had been expecting guests that evening, had prepared a dinner party, then had to flee before anyone arrived. The British officers sat down, ate the dinner, drank the wine, toasted their victory, mocked President Madison, made jokes about eating the president's food in the president's house. It was a moment of humiliation for America. Enemy soldiers dining in the president's house while the president hid somewhere in the countryside. After dinner, they got to work. Their orders were clear: burn the building, destroy it completely, make sure it could never be used again, send a message to America about attacking British territory. British soldiers piled furniture in the center of rooms, broke up chairs, tables, anything wooden, created bonfires inside the building. Then they used a special mixture, gunpowder paste, spread it on walls, on curtains, on anything that would burn. This would ensure the fire spread quickly, burned intensely. They lit the fires around 8 p.m., multiple rooms simultaneously. The flames caught immediately, spread rapidly. The wooden interior of the building burned fast, floors, beams, stairs. Paneling, all wood, all fuel for the fire. The stone walls could not burn, but everything inside them could and did. The fire burned through the night, massive flames, visible for miles, smoke rising into the dark sky. The president's house was burning. America's most important building was being destroyed. Other residents of Washington watched from hiding, saw the flames, felt the humiliation, felt the fear. British soldiers were in their city, burning their buildings, destroying their capital. And there was nothing anyone could do about it. The fire burned for hours. Through the night, the wooden roof collapsed, fell into the building. The interior floors collapsed. Everything wooden was consumed. By morning, only the stone walls remained, blackened, cracked from heat, but standing. August 25th dawned rainy. A thunderstorm moved in. Heavy rain. This helped extinguish the remaining fires, save the walls from further damage. The British had already moved on anyway. They had burned the Capitol building too, and the Treasury and the War Department, all the major government buildings. Their mission was complete. By August 26th, the British withdrew from Washington, marched back to their ships, left the Capitol in ruins. President Madison returned. Looked at the destruction. The president's house was a shell. Blackened walls, no roof, no floors, no interior at all, just a burned-out ruin. The question immediately arose, what now? Should the Capitol be moved? Some suggested Philadelphia, safe, established, proper buildings. Some suggested New York, larger, better protected. Some suggested somewhere in the interior, safer from naval attack. But others argued for staying, for rebuilding. Moving the capital would look like surrender, would look like Britain had won. America needed to show resilience, show determination, show that burning buildings would not defeat the nation. Congress debated, arguments went back and forth. Finally, the decision was made. Stay in Washington, rebuild the Capitol, rebuild the president's house, show the world that America would not be intimidated. This meant construction would begin again. The building would have to be reconstructed, the interior completely rebuilt, and this raised a practical question: who would do the work? The answer was obvious. The same people who built it the first time, free craftsmen and enslaved laborers. The same mixed workforce, the same payment system, the same stolen labor. James Hoban was still in Washington, the original architect, now 57 years old. He knew the building better than anyone, had designed it, had supervised the original construction, the logical choice to supervise reconstruction. In 1815, Hoban was hired again. Same architect, same design, rebuild it as it was before, restore the president's house. But the building was in terrible condition. The stone walls stood, but they were damaged, blackened by smoke, cracked from heat, weakened. They needed repair before any reconstruction could begin. Workers examined every stone, checked for cracks, checked for weakness. Some stones had to be replaced, others could be cleaned and reused. This was delicate work. The walls were structurally important. Any mistakes would be dangerous. And who did this work? Free stonemasons and enslaved laborers. The same combination as before. Free workers examining stones, making decisions about what could be saved. Enslaved workers moving stones, hauling materials, providing the muscle. The payment records from Reconstruction survive, just like the original construction records. Same format, same entries, paid to owner name for hire of Negro labor. Month after month, the system continued exactly as before. Let me give you specific examples, real records from Reconstruction. In 1815, payment went to Mr. Lee for hire of 4 Negroes, 1 month, $20. $4 enslaved workers working on clearing debris or repairing walls. Their owner collected the money. They got nothing. In 1816, payment to Mr. Belt for hire of Negro carpenters, plural, at least 2, skilled workers rebuilding the interior woodwork. As skilled as free carpenters, but earning nothing. The same system, the same injustice. The building had burned down, but the labor practices had not changed at all. Enslaved workers would rebuild what they had built before, would receive nothing again. The work progressed steadily. The stone walls were repaired by 1816, cleaned. Stabilized, ready for reconstruction. Now the interior could be rebuilt. This was almost like building from scratch. New floors, new interior walls, new stairs, new roof, everything wooden had burned, everything had to be replaced. Carpenters did this work, free and enslaved, working together. Creating new structure inside old walls. The roof was rebuilt by 1817. Timber trusses, roof boards, new slate tile. The building was weathertight again, protected from rain. Now interior finishing could proceed, plastering, painting, details. The same finishing work as before, the same skilled trades, the same mixed workforce, free plasterers and enslaved assistants, free painters and enslaved laborers. The building was being restored, but there was one major visible change. The stone walls were smoke-stained, blackened. Even after cleaning, they looked damaged, looked fire-scarred. This was not appropriate for the president's house. The building needed to look fresh, new, untouched by fire. The solution was paint, white paint, cover the smoke damage, create a uniform appearance. Protect the stone, make the building look pristine again. This decision created the name we use today, the White House. Before the fire, it was just called the President's House or the Executive Mansion. After Reconstruction, people started calling it the White House because of the white paint. The name stuck, though it would not become the official name until 1901 when Theodore Roosevelt made it official. So the famous white appearance came from covering fire damage. The name came from Reconstruction. Both results of the 1814 burning, both permanent changes. By late 1817, the building was habitable again, not completely finished, but functional, ready for occupation. James Monroe became president in March 1817. By September, he moved into the reconstructed president's house. The first president to live there since Madison fled in 1814. The reconstruction had taken 3 years, less time than original construction. Why? Because the walls already existed. The foundation was intact. Only the interior needed rebuilding. Still 3 years of intensive work, 3 years of mixed free and enslaved labor. The cost of reconstruction was substantial, not as much as original construction, but still expensive. And just like before, the government saved money by using enslaved labor, saved thousands of dollars, paid owners instead of workers. The system worked exactly as before. Think about what this means. The same building, burned down, rebuilt, using the same unjust labor system. The fire changed the building's appearance, changed its name eventually, but did not change how it was built, did not change who did the work without payment. Enslaved workers built the president's house in 1790–1800. Then enslaved workers rebuilt it in 1815–1817. 17 years of construction, 17 years of stolen labor. Hundreds of workers, thousands of days of work, zero compensation, and for 200 years nobody talked about it. The burning of Washington became a famous story. Dolly Madison saving the portrait became legend. The white paint and the name became iconic, but the enslaved workers forgotten again, invisible again. The reconstructed building stands today, the same stone walls those workers repaired. Some of the same interior timber those workers installed. Their work is permanent, their names are lost. The White House rose from ashes. Rebuilt by the same type of workers who built it first. Free craftsmen and enslaved laborers, working together, paid differently, contributing equally, recognized differently. For 2 centuries, history remembered the fire, remembered the British attack, remembered Dolly's courage, remembered the Reconstruction, but forgot the workers, forgot the stolen labor, forgot the people who actually did the rebuilding. The president's house stood white and beautiful, reconstructed, restored. Ready for presidents and their families, ready for important events, ready for history. By 1817, it was functioning again as the symbol of American democracy. And then something happened that would last for over 150 years, something deliberate, something systematic. Something that reveals how America deals with uncomfortable truths. The erasure began, not intentionally at first, not as a conspiracy, but as a pattern of forgetting, of overlooking, of not mentioning. The enslaved workers who built and rebuilt the president's house simply disappeared from the story. History books were written, tours were given, speeches were made, paintings were created, photographs were taken. Guides explained the architecture, described the rooms. Told stories about presidents, about first ladies, about important events, about the fire and reconstruction, but they never mentioned the workers, never talked about who actually built the building, never acknowledged the hundreds of enslaved people who cut stone and laid brick and mixed mortar and framed walls. Why? Because it was uncomfortable, because it contradicted the narrative, because the White House was supposed to represent freedom, democracy, American values. Mentioning that enslaved people built it created a problem, created questions, created cognitive dissonance. Easier to just not mention it, easier to focus on presidents and architects, easier to tell the comfortable version of history. Let me show you how complete this erasure was, how systematic, how thorough. The official histories of the White House were written starting in the mid-1800s. Books about the building, about its architecture, about the people who lived there. These books mentioned James Hoban, praised his design, mentioned the commissioners, mentioned President Washington's role in selecting the site, but workers barely mentioned, maybe a sentence. The building was constructed by craftsmen and laborers. That is it. No details, no names, no acknowledgement of enslaved labor, just vague references to laborers. Tour guides did the same thing. Starting in the late 1800s, limited public tours were allowed. Guides would walk visitors through the rooms, explain the architecture, point out historical details. This is the East Room where presidents hold receptions. This is the State Dining Room where Dolly Madison saved George Washington's portrait before the British burned the building. Great stories, dramatic stories, but incomplete stories. The guides never said, "This room was plastered by enslaved workers who earned nothing. These walls were built by stone cutters who were paid nothing. This house was constructed partly through stolen labor." Why not? Because tourists did not want to hear it, because it ruined the experience, because people came to admire the White House, not to feel uncomfortable about slavery. School textbooks were even worse. American history classes taught about the Founding Fathers, about the Revolution, about the Constitution, about early presidents. Students learned that Washington, D.C. became the capital in 1800, that the White House was designed by James Hoban, that it burned in 1814 and was rebuilt, but enslaved workers, not mentioned. 0. Students learned the building existed, never learned who built it. The contribution of hundreds of enslaved people was completely erased from educational materials. This continued for generations. For over a century, millions of students learned about the White House. None learned about enslaved workers. The erasure was so complete that most Americans had no idea, no clue, no awareness that slavery played any role in building the Capitol. Even the historical records were neglected. The payment ledgers existed, sat in the National Archives, documented everything, paid to Mr. Blagden for hire of Negro labor. Entry after entry, proof, evidence. Clear documentation of enslaved workers being hired to build the White House. But nobody looked at those records. Historians did not seek them out. Archivists did not highlight them. They just sat there, gathering dust, containing truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Why were the names not recorded originally? That question reveals everything about how enslaved people were viewed in the 1790s and early 1800s. Free workers were recorded by full name. John Henderson stonemason, hired September 1794, $3 per week. Complete information. The worker was a person, had an identity, deserved documentation. Enslaved workers were recorded as property. 3 Negroes hired from Mr. Young, $15 per month. No individual names. No personal information. They were a commodity like timber or stone. You documented the quantity and cost, not the individuals. Sometimes a first name appears. Negro Ben, Negro Daniel, Negro Harry, first name only, just enough to distinguish one worker from another if there was a problem. Which worker was injured? Oh, that was Ben. Make a note that Ben cannot work this month. No last names, no ages, no family information, no skills documented, nothing that would make them human individuals, just first names, property labels. This was deliberate. This reflected how enslaved people were legally categorized as property, not persons. The documentation reflected the law, and the law reflected the racism of the time. Payment records listed owner names clearly, because owners were people, were citizens, had legal rights. Had full names and addresses and social standing. They mattered, their workers did not. So for 200 years we had detailed records of owners, but almost no records of workers. We knew who got paid, we did not know who did the work. The system was designed to make enslaved people invisible, and it worked. Fast forward to the 20th century. The White House became more famous. More visitors, more tourists, more public interest, more books, more media attention, more everything, except truth about enslaved workers. The 1960s and 1970s brought civil rights movement, more attention to Black history, more questions about slavery, more interest in telling complete American history. But still, the White House tour did not mention enslaved workers. The official histories did not change. The erasure continued. Why? Partly because nobody knew where to look. The payment records existed but were scattered through archives, not cataloged specifically as enslaved labor on White House. Just general construction records. Finding them required deliberate research, and nobody was doing that research. Partly because it challenged national mythology. The White House was sacred space in American consciousness, symbol of democracy. Tourists came to be inspired, to feel proud, to connect with American greatness. Telling them about enslaved labor felt like spoiling that experience. Partly because of racism. Even after civil rights legislation, there was resistance to acknowledging Black contributions to American history, to admitting that enslaved people built important national monuments, to giving credit where credit was due. But finally, in the 1990s, things began to change. Slowly, gradually. Some historians started asking questions, started looking at those old payment records, started connecting dots. The White House Historical Association began researching, actually digging through archives, looking for evidence, finding the payment ledgers, documenting the system of hiring enslaved workers, recovering what information existed. What they found was clear, undeniable. Hundreds of enslaved workers had been involved. Government had paid their owners, the workers had received nothing. The evidence was documented, official records proved everything. But finding evidence was only the first step. The harder step was public acknowledgement. Actually telling people, actually changing the narrative, actually admitting that the White House was built partly through enslaved labor. That took longer, much longer, because it meant challenging 200 years of silence. Meant making people uncomfortable. Meant changing how the White House was presented and discussed. Some names were recovered, not many, but some. Let me tell you about the ones we know. Philip Reed. He was an enslaved man who worked on the Capitol building, not the White House specifically, but he was part of the same system. He helped cast the bronze Statue of Freedom that sits atop the Capitol dome. Skilled metalworker. His contribution was finally acknowledged in recent years. His name is now part of Capitol history. Daniel. First name only, appears in White House payment records, hired from his owner, worked for several months in 1795, probably a carpenter based on when he was hired. That is all we know. First name, year, probable skill, everything else is lost. Ben, another first name, another fragment, hired in 1796. Worked into 1797. Payment records show his owner was paid $5 per month for Ben's labor. Was he skilled, unskilled, young, old? We do not know, just a name and dates. Peter, hired in 1794, worked through 1795. His owner received payments for 14 months, over a year of work. Peter spent over a year of his life building the president's house, earned nothing. That is his entire recorded history, a name and a timeline. There were hundreds more. We know they existed because we have payment records. We know approximately how many because we can count the payments. But we do not have their names, do not know their stories, do not know anything about them except that they worked and were not paid. This is the tragedy, not just that their labor was stolen, but that their identities were erased. They built something permanent, something that still stands, something millions of people see every year, but they remain anonymous, unknown, forgot. The research continues. Historians still search archives, still look for any mention of names, any biographical detail, any information at all. Every name recovered feels like a small victory, a small correction to historical injustice, but most will never be recovered. The names were not written down, the information does not exist. The erasure was too complete. We can prove enslaved workers built the White House. We can prove how many approximately. We can prove the payment system, but we cannot name most of them. Imagine that. You spend months or years of your life building the most important house in America. Your work is still standing over 200 years later. Millions of people have seen what you built, and nobody knows your name. Nobody knows you existed. You are completely forgot. That is what happened to hundreds of enslaved workers. Their contributions were essential. Their work was permanent, but their identities were erased. For 200 years, they were invisible. The question is, why did it take so long to acknowledge them? Why did America wait 200 years to tell the truth? The answer is complicated, partly ignorance. Many people genuinely did not know. The information was buried in archives, not taught in schools, not mentioned in official histories. Most Americans, white and black, had no idea enslaved workers built the White House, partly discomfort. Once people did know, there was resistance to talking about it. It created cognitive dissonance. How do you celebrate the White House while acknowledging it was built through slavery? How do you take pride in American democracy while admitting democratic symbols were built by people denied democracy? Partly racism. Even in the late 20th century, there was resistance to acknowledging black contributions to American history, to giving enslaved people credit for skilled work, to admitting that American greatness was built partly on stolen black labor. But eventually, the truth became too obvious to ignore. The records existed. The evidence was clear. Historians were publishing findings. The information was getting out. The White House Historical Association could no longer pretend enslaved workers did not exist. So slowly, very slowly, acknowledgement began. Website updates, tour script changes, educational materials revised. The truth started entering public consciousness, but full public acknowledgement, that took until 2016, until a speech by a first lady, until someone with a platform spoke the truth plainly, until Michelle Obama said what needed to be said. That moment changed everything. That moment broke 200 years of silence. That moment forced America to confront the uncomfortable truth. Let me tell you about that speech and what happened after. July 25, 2016, the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. Michelle Obama stood at the podium, First Lady of the United States. The first African-American First Lady, about to give a speech that would finally break 224 years of silence. She talked about raising her daughters in the White House, about teaching them values, about showing them what America represents. And then she said the words that changed everything. I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. Simple sentence, 12 words, but those 12 words did what 200 years of history books had failed to do. They told the truth, plainly, directly, without euphemism, without softening. The White House was built by enslaved people. The First Lady acknowledged it on national television in front of millions of viewers. The reaction was immediate. Some people were shocked. I never knew that. Why didn't anyone teach us this? How did I not know? The erasure had been so complete that millions of Americans, educated Americans, had no idea enslaved workers built the White House. Some people were moved. Finally someone with authority was telling the truth. Finally, the forgotten workers were being acknowledged. After 224 years of silence, a First Lady was speaking their truth. Some people were defensive. Why does she have to bring that up? Why focus on the negative? Can't we just appreciate the building? The discomfort was real. The resistance was real. Truth makes people uncomfortable when it contradicts their comfortable narratives. But Michelle Obama did not back down, did not apologize, did not soften her words. She meant what she said. She woke up every morning in a house built by enslaved people. That was fact, that was history, that was truth. And that truth mattered because of who she was, an African-American woman living in the White House. Her ancestors might have been enslaved, might have built buildings like the White House, might have worked without compensation just like the workers who built her current home. The irony was powerful, the symbolism was undeniable. The great-great-granddaughter of enslaved people living in a house built by enslaved people, living there as First Lady, as one of the most powerful women in America. The contrast with the workers who built the house could not be more stark. Those workers were property, had no rights, had no freedom, could not vote, could not own property, could not even own themselves. Michelle Obama was First Lady, had education, had career, had agency, had influence, had everything those workers were denied. Her presence in the White House was progress, undeniable progress, but her acknowledgement of how it was built was honesty, necessary honesty. You cannot truly appreciate progress without acknowledging the starting point. And the starting point was enslaved people building the house where she now lived. The speech created a moment, a cultural moment. Suddenly, everyone was talking about enslaved workers and the White House. News articles, think pieces, social media discussions, educational materials. The topic that had been ignored for 2 centuries was suddenly everywhere. The White House Historical Association responded. They had been researching this for years, had documented the evidence, but now there was public interest. Now people wanted to know. They created educational materials, website content, detailed information about enslaved workers and their role in building the White House. They published the names they had recovered. Philip Reed, Daniel, Ben Peter, not many names, but they published what they had, gave those workers some identity, some acknowledgement, some place in history. They published payment records, showed the actual ledgers, paid to Mr. Blagden for hire of Negro labor, entry after entry, proof, documentation, evidence that could not be denied. The government had hired enslaved workers, had paid their owners, had built the White House partly through stolen labor. They calculated numbers. At least 400 enslaved workers involved over the construction and reconstruction periods, thousands of days of labor, millions of individual tasks, all unpaid, all unacknowledged until now. They created timeline, showed when enslaved workers were used, 1792 to 1800 for original construction, 1815 to 1817 for reconstruction, even after that for repairs and improvements. Decades of enslaved labor on the White House, but research and documentation were not enough. Physical acknowledgement was needed, something permanent, something visitors could see, something that would ensure the truth was never forgotten again. In 2017, a historical marker was erected outside the White House, placed by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. A bronze plaque, permanent, public, impossible to ignore. The marker reads, "Enslaved and free African Americans helped build the White House and the United States Capitol in the 1790s and 1800s. Many lived nearby, and residents of Washington could see and interact with them every day." Simple words, but powerful words, permanent acknowledgement. After 225 years, there was finally a physical marker recognizing enslaved workers' contributions. Visitors could see it, could read it, could understand that enslaved people built this building. This mattered enormously because physical markers create permanent memory. Tour guides can skip uncomfortable topics. History books can be selective, but a bronze plaque stays there, cannot be ignored, forces acknowledgement. The marker also sparked conversations. Tourists would see it, ask questions, want to know more. This created opportunities for education, for telling the full story, for honoring the forgotten workers. Tour scripts were updated. White House tour now mention enslaved workers, not extensively, not in detail, but they mention it. The White House was built between 1792 and 1800 using both free workers and enslaved labor hired from local plantations. 30 seconds, maybe a minute, in a tour that lasts an hour or more, but it is something, it is acknowledgement, it is truth. After 200 years of silence, it is progress. School curricula were updated too. American history textbooks now include this information. Students learn that enslaved workers built the White House and Capitol. Learn about the payment system. Learn about the contradiction between American ideals and American practices. Not all textbooks, not all schools, but more than before, the information is entering educational mainstream. Future generations will grow up knowing this truth, will not have to discover it as adults like their parents did. The question remains, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we acknowledge enslaved workers 200 plus years later? They are all dead. Their descendants are scattered. Nothing we do now changes what happened to them, but it matters for several reasons, deep reasons, important reasons. First, truth matters. History should be honest, complete, not selective, not sanitized. If we only tell comfortable parts of history, we are lying. We are creating mythology, not history. Acknowledging enslaved workers is about basic honesty, about telling the full story. Second, credit matters. The enslaved workers who built the White House did skilled work, important work, work that still stands today. They deserve credit, deserve recognition, deserve to be remembered. Not acknowledging them is theft twice over. First stealing their labor, then stealing their legacy. Third, understanding matters. You cannot understand American history without understanding slavery. Cannot understand how America was built without acknowledging who built it. The White House is a symbol of America. Understanding how it was built is understanding how America was built, through mixed free and enslaved labor. Through contradiction between ideals and practices. Through stolen black labor supporting white wealth and power. Fourth, justice matters, even symbolic justice. We cannot compensate those workers, cannot give them the wages they earned, cannot give them the freedom they deserved, but we can remember them, can speak their names when we know them, can acknowledge their contribution, can ensure they are not forgot. That is the minimum justice we owe them. Fifth, context matters. Michelle Obama's presence in the White House is meaningful because of who built it. The progress she represents is measured against the workers who were enslaved. The distance between enslaved carpenter in 1795 and First Lady in 2016 is the distance America has traveled. Understanding the starting point makes the progress real. Let me give you the final numbers, the complete accounting, because numbers matter. Numbers make it concrete. Original construction cost $232,372 in $1,800, approximately $7 million in today's money. About half the labor was enslaved labor, so roughly $5 million worth of stolen labor in current dollars. Reconstruction cost not precisely recorded, but substantial, again using mixed free and enslaved labor, probably another $1 million in stolen labor in current terms. Total approximately $5 million in today's money. That is the value of enslaved labor that built and rebuilt the White House. Labor that was never compensated, never acknowledged, never remembered. 400 enslaved workers over approximately 30 years of construction and reconstruction. Average maybe $11,000 per worker in today's money that should have been paid but was not. That is their stolen wages. That is what they earned but never received. But money is not the real cost. The real cost was human. 400 people spent months or years of their lives building the White House. They used their skills, their strength, their intelligence, their time. They gave everything. Received nothing, not even recognition. Some probably died during construction. Injuries, accidents, disease, we do not know how many. The records do not say. Their deaths were not considered important enough to document. They were property. Property losses might be recorded for insurance purposes. But the human cost, nobody cared. Some probably hoped for freedom. Maybe thought their skilled work would lead to manumission. Maybe thought their contribution would be rewarded. They were wrong. When construction ended, they went back to their owners, back to bondage. Their hope was crushed. Some probably felt pride in their work despite everything. Pride in building something important, something permanent, something beautiful. That pride was stolen too when their contribution was forgotten. When their names were erased, when history ignored them, the White House stands today. Same stone walls, much of the same timber structure inside. The work of those enslaved laborers is permanent, visible. Millions of people see it every year, tourists from around the world, dignitaries, presidents. all walking through spaces built partly by enslaved people. Now finally, some of those visitors know the truth. Know who built it, know the cost, know the contradiction, know the uncomfortable history. The White House is a symbol of American democracy, that is true, but it is also a symbol of American slavery. Both are true, both are part of its history, both must be acknowledged. The building represents freedom, but it was built by people who had no freedom. The building represents democracy. But it was built by people denied all democratic rights. The building represents American ideals, but it was built through practices that contradicted those ideals completely. That contradiction is America. That tension between ideals and practices is American history. The White House embodies that contradiction, makes it visible, makes it undeniable. Acknowledging enslaved workers is not about attacking the White House, not about diminishing its importance, not about making people feel guilty. It is about honesty, about completeness, about telling the whole truth. The White House can be both a symbol of democracy and a reminder of slavery. Both things are true, both things matter. Mature nations can acknowledge complicated history, can hold contradictions, can tell uncomfortable truths. For 224 years, America was not mature enough to do that, not honest enough, not brave enough. We told the comfortable story, ignored the uncomfortable truth, pretended enslaved workers did not exist. Michelle Obama's speech in 2016 changed that, broke the silence. Forced acknowledgement made the truth unavoidable. The historical marker in 2017 made it permanent. Now the truth is part of the White House story, part of how we understand the building, part of American memory. The work continues. Historians still search for names, still look for biographical information, still try to recover what was deliberately not recorded. Every name found is a small victory. Every detail recovered is progress. Educational efforts continue. More schools teaching this history, more tours mentioning it, more websites documenting it, more public awareness. Slowly, the truth is becoming common knowledge, is entering mainstream understanding of American history, but the workers are still mostly anonymous, still mostly forgotten. We know they existed. Know approximately how many. Know what they did, but we do not know who most of them were. Their names are lost, their stories are lost, their identities are lost. That is the tragedy that cannot be fixed. We can acknowledge them collectively, can honor their contribution generally, but we cannot name them individually, cannot tell their personal stories, cannot give them individual recognition. The erasure was too complete, so we remember them as a group. The hundreds of enslaved workers who built the White House, who cut stone and mixed mortar and framed walls and laid floors, who worked without wages, who received no recognition, who were forgotten for 200 years, we remember that their work stands, that millions of people benefit from what they built. That the most important house in America exists because of their stolen labor. We remember that every president has lived in a house built by enslaved people. That symbol of American freedom was created by people who had no freedom. That contradiction is American history. That truth is now part of American memory. Finally, after 224 years of silence, after generations of erasure, after centuries of forgetting, the truth stands, the building stands, both together. Both permanent, both part of American legacy.